Nickelodeon has created a lot of iconic cartoons. Shows like SpongeBob and Avatar: The Last Airbender have become insanely popular franchises. But for every huge success that Nick has created, there's like a dozen other shows that couldn't achieve the same level of success and were inevitably cancelled. Those shows, for the most part, tend to be forgotten, destined for obscurity, and only remembered by some of the people that managed to watch them when they originally aired. But then, there are other animated shows that have become cult classics following their cancellation. And one of these shows is Invader Zim, one of the most unique cartoons that Nickelodeon has ever produced. Its blend of dark comedy and genuine horror made a huge impact on those who grew up watching it, since it really stood out when compared to other cartoons that were airing at the time. Invader Zim's episodes didn't focus on his characters learning any morals or life lessons. It wasn't wholesome like Rugrats, far from it. It was surreal, funny, and unsettling at the same time, without being afraid of actually scaring its audience.
Thank you, Zim!
All of these elements have made it a very memorable cartoon, but at the time, being so unique made it difficult for the show to be widely appealing and popular, leading to its eventual cancellation after only 2 short seasons. However, before it was cancelled, there were many planned episodes which were in different stages of production, with many of them already being storyboarded, voice recorded, and almost completed. So I want to go over all of these cancelled episodes that were never finished, and also take a look at some very interesting early designs, concept art, and ideas for the series that ended up being rejected for different reasons. Invader Zim was created by Jonan Vasquez, an incredibly talented writer and artist that initially started his professional career by creating his own indie comic books, with his earliest professional work being Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. Jonan actually created Johnny the Homicidal Maniac while he was still attending high school. The character was first published as comic strips in a school newspaper, and continued appearing in a goth magazine called Carpe Noctem, with slave labor publications later picking up the idea for a black and white indie comic published in 1995. The comic follows Johnny, a deeply disturbed psychopath that kills and tortures anyone who slightly annoys him. Johnny also has a next door neighbor called Squee, a little kid that's pretty much afraid of everything, and who Johnny empathizes with since he notices that Squee's parents are neglectful and don't really take care of him. But what's so funny about their dynamic is that Squee is one of the few people that actually know that Johnny is a serial killer, so he's obviously terrified of him. I only mention this because Squee eventually got his own spin-off comic book, since Johnny the Homicidal Maniac proved to be a success. And during an issue of that spin-off comic that showed all of the things that make Squee scared, Jonan briefly drew a short alien invader for a small panel. And that design was later used as an original basis for Zim's eventual design. This is all explained in the 2020 book, The Art of Invader Zim by Chris McDonald, which was one of the main sources I used while making this video. And this design was the earliest conception of the little green guy, who would eventually be called Zim. And throughout his design evolution, we can see how his look became more angular and less rounded, as Jonan Vasquez continued working on him, until he eventually settled on Zim's final design for the series. The book also describes how in the 90s, Jonan became recognized for his successful comic book work, and he was approached by MTV in order to produce an animated series, though he initially declined because he wanted to solely focus on making comics. Some years later though, he was contacted by Mary Harrington, a network executive at Nickelodeon who produced many classic shows like Rugrats, Ren and Stimpy, Hey Arnold, and many other series, and she proposed to Jonan the chance to create an animated series for Nick, and he accepted. While it may seem a little odd for a network that mainly made shows aimed at kids to hire an artist that was popular for creating really dark and violent comic books, Jonan Vasquez himself didn't really find the proposition to be weird, and in the book I mentioned previously, he even states that Nickelodeon specifically said to him that they wanted to create a new series that could appeal to older kids, to diversify their lineup and have a new program that wouldn't compete with other shows aimed at younger audiences. And in a 2004 IGN interview, he also expanded on this, saying that Nick had also told them that their intention was to capture some of the older audience that Cartoon Network and their lineup of shows were getting. Since, besides Ren and Stimpy, Nickelodeon wasn't really known for having very edgy cartoons at the time. With this in mind, he later pitched to them the idea of Invader Zim. While working on the early development of the show, Vasquez produced a series Bible, and in there we can find many interesting early ideas and concepts they had for the series. It's very interesting to see the early designs for Dib and Gaz and how they evolved. Gaz looks really cute, especially with that single tooth poking out like that. It's adorable. And Dib's early designs have him wearing a lab coat, just like his father, Dr. Membrane. Though by the time they made the series Bible, they had already landed on his final look with a black trench coat. The Bible overall paints an accurate picture of what the show would eventually become. It describes many of the settings, characters, and plot details that would be translated onto the series, but there are some planned ideas that weren't used in the end. For example, while Zim is being described as coming from the planet Urk, the name of his alien race was originally going to be called the Knowing, a play on the word annoying, though this idea was ultimately dropped in favor of just calling the race Urkans to simplify things. The structure of the show's episodes were also meant to be different and much looser originally. The series Bible compared the intended episode structure of the series to Animaniacs, since in the original vision for Invader Zim, it wouldn't focus on a single storyline that lasted the entire episode. Instead, they wanted to do a more frantic and distorted style that had multiple different short segments in each episode, being described as a collection of bizarre vignettes. And these short segments could follow different characters other than the three protagonists of Zim, Dib, and Gaz, with the Bible giving examples for some shorts, like one about Gur being left alone in the house and having him deal with a burglar, or another one where the almighty tallest would argue with each other over who was the tallest. This idea was rejected because Nickelodeon wanted the show to have a clear main character and wanted its stories to be more structured. The series Bible mentions the X-Files as an influence for the show, comparing the dynamic between Dib and Gaz with that of Mulder and Scully, and its inspiration can also be felt with elements like the Swollen Eyeball Network and focus on paranormal investigators. It also compared the show's style of slapstick and animated elasticity with how Tex Avery deformed and exaggerated the features of the characters in his cartoons. It also mentions Cape Fear of all things as an influence, for its sense of paranoia and underlying dread, which is understandable, but I'd never expect a movie where Robert De Niro stalks a guy's family to take revenge and tries stuff with his daughter to be mentioned as an influence for a cartoon. Alien, however, I totally understand being an influence for Invader Zim, and Jonan Vasquez has mentioned in interviews that the original Alien movie had a huge impact on his art style and sensibilities as a whole, not only in Invader Zim. And who could possibly forget Gur dressing up as a xenomorph for Halloween? The series Bible gave synopses for episode ideas, some of which ended up being made, but some ideas were never used throughout the entire show. For example, they thought about making an episode where it would be show and tell day at Zim's school, with the children having to present things that are important to them. Zim decides to show a limp little kitty, believing that it would make him look like a normal Earth boy, but this soon backfires on him once he starts having a violent, disgusting allergic reaction in front of everyone. This premise was never used in the end, and an interesting fact is that a redditor named Opalite actually adapted this idea for a short fan comic in 2019, which is really cool, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. Another unused episode would have focused on Zim's wig, with it gaining awareness due to a reaction with the space oils on Zim's head. The wig would turn out to be pure evil and start controlling Zim's body against his will, and the wig would have also had a James Earl Jones type of voice. This personally reminds me of the Treehouse of Horror segment from The Simpsons, where Snake dies and his hair literally gets transplanted onto Homer, only for the wig to come to life with Snake's spirit still inside it. They also considered doing an episode about Zim creating a viral-like infectious yawn of terror, a super yawn that can spread whenever another person hears the yawn of someone who's infected, with each yawn getting progressively more exaggerated until they are placed into a deep sleep. However, Zim himself would become infected by this super yawn and is forced to develop a cure, which would also end up curing the rest of Earth. They also considered doing an episode where we would have seen Zim and Gur traveling to an Urkan colony where other invaders gathered to discuss their accomplishments and findings, but what they don't know is that Dib and Gaz also followed them to this secret meeting in outer space, and they would inevitably come into conflict. The last episode idea that wasn't adapted from the series Bible would have had Zim investigating an old abandoned house where Gur says that an alien monster is living. In reality though, Gur completely made this up, and in order to not get caught lying, Gur would have pretended to be the monster himself. Coming back to that Art of Invader Zim book that I mentioned earlier, Jonan Vasquez described another early idea for a story that they never ended up making, which would have been an episode where Zim tries to get everyone on Earth to sleep, and uses some weasels that are able to put people to sleep if they were placed on their heads. But people need to put the weasels on their head willingly, and in order to do so, Zim would have tried to make the weasels into a fashionable item and a trend. This idea sounds kind of similar to the Super Yawn idea mentioned in the series Bible, since they both revolve around Zim wanting to put everyone on Earth to sleep. One of the synopses from the series Bible that was ultimately adapted was a food fight between Zim and Dib in the school cafeteria, a premise that was used for the original pilot of the show. And an interesting fact about the pilot is that it was originally meant to have a 3D sequence during the middle of the food fight. While it wasn't included in the final version of the pilot, there was some CG animated test footage created while it was being considered, and some stills of that supposed sequence have been leaked online, with some comments from a Q&A for Invader Zim's DVD release, saying that the 3D animation test was planned to be included as a DVD bonus, but they were apparently having issues finding the real up-res version of it, and there's not much else information we know about this lost 3D sequence, so we can't really be sure of its true validity, or even if it's completely real. Another cool fact about the pilot is that it originally had a different voice actor for Zim. In the show's early stages, they were actually considering having Billy West as the voice for Zim, a voice actor who you might know for his roles on Futurama, mainly Fry, and other roles on many other cartoons as well. He's a very prolific and talented voice actor, so it's only natural that they considered him for the role of Zim.
Evil intestines.
Reveal my intestines? Grr! Meet me in the making stuff room!
They ultimately didn't go with him due to his popularity in Futurama, and they didn't want to be associated with another more famous sci-fi animated show. Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, and the Joker himself was also considered for the role of Zim. His voice, however, was ironically kind of too dark and evil to be the voice of Zim, since while Zim is supposed to be a villain, he's also very incompetent and a bit of an idiot, and that aspect of the character wasn't really captured in Hamill's performance. It was a great performance, of course, but he sounded too menacing to be Zim in my opinion.
So, by some simple stroke of luck, you have managed to discover my sinister secret, my secret of doom, if you will.
In the end, they went with voice actor Richard Stephen Horvitz, who had previously played Daggett on Angry Beavers, since they wanted a lesser-known voice actor who could become instantly recognizable as Zim. Now, besides cancelled episodes that were never made, there's also some examples of rejected ideas from episodes that were made, but that had to be changed due to network demands. You might remember that really annoying kid from the episode Game Slavers 2, who pissed off Gas after he bought the last portable console available for sale. He was called Iggins, and at the end of the episode he fell down an elevator shaft while fighting with Gas, where he was later shown flying away mostly unharmed. Originally though, Jonan Vasquez revealed in an old IGN interview that they initially wanted to imply that Iggins had died in that scene, but they weren't allowed to do so by the network. Another piece of cut content from that specific scene is that Dib would have been transformed into one of the rat people that had also appeared in that episode, and there was an animatic included in the series DVD release that shows this. Iggins was also supposedly meant to die during an explosion in the episode Walk for Your Lives, which I couldn't fully corroborate, but I still wanted to mention it because I find it really funny that the show's writers tried to kill Iggins not once, but twice. They still tried to kill the little kid even after the network had already told them no, and that's hilarious. The episode Door to Door also had some very interesting cut content as well. As explained by Jonan and the writers in the episode's DVD commentary, there's a scene that had to be altered where Zim enters a very filthy house and tries to persuade the family inside to buy some chocolate bars he's selling by connecting them to a virtual reality headset that shows them horrible visions of the future. But originally, those sausages the kids were eating were meant to be cockroaches instead, and the visions the family saw were meant to show more destruction and even the Statue of Liberty.
You know, originally the kids were eating cockroaches.
That's right, they were cockroaches, they turned them into weenies.
Turned them into wieners back then.
Isn't there an interesting story about this?
Originally it's just a flaming city with, with buildings on fire and around
unfortunately there was a Statue of Liberty in there.
Oh, yeah, that's right, baby.
We have to keep in mind that Invader Zim was produced and aired from 2001 to 2002, around the time that 9/11 happened, which was of course a very tragic situation with huge ramifications that ended up affecting basically everything in some way during that time, and it inevitably affected what TV shows could and couldn't show. And given that Door to Door aired just a few months after 9/11 had happened, it's completely understandable why Nickelodeon wouldn't want to show a scene that had New York City on fire. Seeing kids eating some cockroaches would have been pretty funny though, but unfortunately, in the end, the show was abruptly cancelled while season 2 was still in production. Many reasons have been cited as to why, such as the network receiving too many complaints from concerned parents due to it being so dark, the show being too expensive to produce, and it having low ratings when compared to other cartoons. The truth was probably a combination of these reasons, but Jonan Vasquez has said in interviews that he believes the show's low ratings was most likely the biggest reason why the show was cancelled, given that if the viewership was strong, that would have been enough to justify keeping the series alive. In a book by series writer Eric Trueheart called The Medium-Sized Book of Zim Scripts, which has a lot of insightful details from the show's production, he mentioned that after 9/11, National Amusements, which is the parent company of Viacom and of Nickelodeon by extension, had to do budget cuts for most of its subsidiaries and their then current projects, which for Nickelodeon meant that they were obligated to trim down their expenses by cutting the production of one of their shows. And given that Invader Zim wasn't pulling in the same viewership or was as marketable as the Nickelodeon's other more popular shows, like The Fairly OddParents or SpongeBob, the most logical choice was to cancel Invader Zim. In a 2004 IGN interview, Jonan Vasquez also said that they asked Nickelodeon to consider moving the show onto MTV, but they weren't interested. But it could have been potentially really cool to see Invader Zim could continue as an adult animated series. Eric Trueheart stated that they received the news of Invader Zim's cancellation in the middle of Season 2's production, and there were many episodes that were already partially completed by the time the crew received the news that Invader Zim would cease production. And now I'd like to briefly go over all of these planned episode ideas. Robo Parents Gone Crazy would have been an episode about Zim's robotic parents malfunctioning due to a power surge, and them starting to act with more agency of their own. They would have kicked Zim out of his own house, and later adopt a monkey/badger hybrid named Dinky. Zim would end up living with a homeless man, who eventually gives Zim advice that motivates him to sneak back into his house by pretending to be the new pet, Dinky, and once in his house he would be able to fix his robotic parents. There's a full script available online for the episode, and there were also voice recordings done for it before the series was cancelled.
Ew, don't talk to your dad like that. A certain little green boy is going to bed without dinner tonight.
Ed, Perkins don't sleep.
Simon Says Doom was another episode that would have focused on Dib volunteering at an orphanage after seeing that Zim was already volunteering there, which made Dib very suspicious and prompted him to keep a closer eye on Zim. At the orphanage, he sees Zim playing Simon Says with the kids, and they were actually doing what Zim told them to do, with Zim later exclaiming, "Simon Says conquer the earth," and he would use the kids to cause chaos across the city. The script and voice recordings for this episode have also been shared online. Invader Punchy would have seen Zim orchestrating a plot to have his classmates believe that another kid in his class named Punchy is actually an alien, and that way people wouldn't be suspicious of him, and he would do that by implanting Irken technology in Punchy's room. Zim's plan would soon backfire though, as Punchy would come into the possession of a super weapon which he believes is a video game, and it could potentially destroy Earth. Nubs of Doom is an episode that would have seen Zim finally grow tired of Gur always ruining his plans and disobeying his orders, so he would try to create a new sidekick called Mini Moose, a tiny purple floating moose that's really cute, but who is actually supposed to be made of dangerous doomsday technology. Minimus was actually intended to make his debut in this unfinished episode, which is why it would have focused on Minimus's origin, but he only ended up appearing in Season 2's Christmas episode, with him later returning for the revival movie, Enter the Florpus. Gur's Big Day would have been the writer's attempt at giving Gur his very own episode focused on him, since they had noticed how he became a fan favorite to many fans, and that there was a demand for an episode showcasing Gur. In Eric Trueheart's book, he mentions that they originally considered having Gur hanging out with a mentally handicapped man named Bucky. who would have been based on the character Lenny from the book Of Mice and Men, but they felt that it would have been too distasteful to make jokes about someone with a mental disability. They later envisioned a story about Gur being hit by a truck while he was in his dog disguise, with people later recovering him and wondering how a dog could have possibly survived being hit by a truck. Some scientists would end up taking in Gur and trying to clone him, but during the cloning process, some donut crumbs would have gotten mixed up with the DNA, turning Gur into a giant dog-donut mutant hybrid who would have destroyed the city. This general idea of a Gur-centric story would be later adapted for the first issue of the 2020 comic book Invader Zim Quarterly. Return of Keith would have been another episode that heavily featured Keith, the young kid from the episode Bestest Friend, where Zim used him to appear like a normal person to the other kids at school. Return of Keith would have seen Sim dumping a blue liquid onto Dib, which would make him explode if he showed positive emotions. Dib would remind Sim that it's a pretty stupid plan, because Dib is never really happy, especially when he's around Zim, and so Sim leaves him alone. Keith saw this interaction between Dib and Zim, and he assumed that they were actually friends that just got into a disagreement, and in the episode he would have attempted to get Dib and Zim to make up and salvage their friendship. Day of the Spookies would have had Zim trying to make Dib stop believing in the paranormal and the supernatural. He would attempt to do so by disguising himself as different monsters to haunt Dib, with Gur, Minimus, and Invader Scooch also helping him out. Mopiness of Doom was going to show Dib finally losing interest in investigating paranormal activities, after failing to defeat Zim in yet another embarrassing situation, and after telling this to his dad, he would convince Dib to devote himself to studying real science. All of this would make Zim very confused, as he notices that Dib no longer tries to stop him, and it would even make him kinda depressed, since he would have lost his only enemy. Another rumored cancelled episode was titled Those, and while not that much information is known about this one, it supposedly would have been a parody of the 1954 B-movie Them, a monster movie that had giant ants that had been mutated by nuclear radiation. Top of the line was a premise where we would have seen a competition between the Seer units of all the Urkin invaders, with Gur ultimately being the winner after destroying all of the other Seer units, except for the Seers of Invader Scooch and Invader 10. Tak would have also reportedly made an appearance. One of the coolest unmade episodes that we know about was called The Trial. The story would have focused on Zim's existence evaluation, a process where an Urkin's entire life is analyzed and judged to see if they truly deserve to be remembered in Urkin history, or if they had to be deactivated and forgotten from all history records. This would have been one of the most interesting potential episodes, since it was going to actually show many of the most important moments in Sim's life before the show started, expanding on his backstory and on Urkin lore, like showing how Sim was born, and how he caused Urk to be plunged into 5 years of darkness as soon as he was born. It would have shown Sim unintentionally killing 2 previous Almighty Tallest when he was younger, and it would have shown the current Almighty Tallest before they became the leaders of Urk, showing that what actually made them tall was their robot suits, since biologically they were also normal Urkins before being promoted into their positions. While Zim was on trial, back on Earth they would have shown how Gur actually conquered Earth by himself in a single day by using a powerful laser throughout the planet. And it's just so funny and clever to show Gur conquering Earth so easily after Zim spent 2 entire seasons trying to do that, but failing miserably every time. The script for the episode is also available online, and while it hadn't been voice recorded by the time the show was cancelled, the show's cast did do a full table reading of the script during InvaderCon a few years back, which is a convention for Invader Zim. And something awesome about this is that a group of incredibly talented artists and fans of the show have made a fan animation that adapts the script of The Trial while using the show's actors' recording from InvaderCon. It was uploaded on Rainbot's YouTube channel, and I'm gonna leave a link for it in the description since it's fantastic and really worth checking out. I also encourage you to search for Invader Zim Lost Episodes on YouTube, since many fans have also done similar efforts with other of the unfinished episodes that I've been talking about, giving us a more cohesive and entertaining way to watch some of these rejected stories. It Feeds on Noodles was a planned episode that would have had Zim transforming into a vampire after visiting a Chinese restaurant, but instead of feeding on blood, he would have needed to consume noodles to stay alive. The premise of 10 Minutes of Doom would have revolved around Zim losing his alien backpack, which is a really big problem because without it, Zim would die in only 10 minutes. Dib would have stolen the backpack, with it attaching itself onto Dib and start making him act more like Zim. Meanwhile, Zim would track him down so he could recover the backpack. As his health rapidly deteriorates, the original plan for the episode would have also seen Zim die in the end of the story, but Nickelodeon went against this idea. Squishy Hugger of Worlds is yet another planned episode for the show, conceived by Eric Trueheart and Ricky Simmons, who was the voice of Gurr. Detailed on Trueheart's book that I mentioned earlier in the video, the episode would have focused on a giant, friendly alien creature that roamed throughout space, hugging entire planets until they were destroyed, kinda like a friendlier Galactus that doesn't understand that he's killing planets when he tries to show them love. Zim and Dib would have had a competition to see who would be the first to be able to stop the creature from destroying Earth. Beefus Megabombus would have been about Zim trying to get rid of a colony of bees that had created a hive on the back of his house, but instead of being normal bees, these would have been giant bees that sang pirate sea shanties, and instead of pollen, they would have consumed beef. There was also meant to be an episode focusing on the Burrito King line of fast food restaurants that we can see throughout the show, but we don't have many details beyond that it would have been written by Eric Trueheart. Plastimart Rising is yet another episode idea described in Eric Trueheart's book, and it would have had Zim and Gurr being stranded on a convenience store stuck in the middle of nowhere after their spaceship ran out of fuel, and they would have interacted with some rural redneck stereotypes, with Zim actually being called a quote-unquote green-skinned minority. Zim and Gurr would later get arrested by the cops after eating a lot of junk food from the store without paying. Pants is a very interesting cancelled episode that would have focused on Zim using living, mind-controlling pants to take over the city, and he convinces people to use the pants by making them a fashionable trend. Dib later finds out that the pants are actually a race of aliens that got stranded on Earth, and were convinced by Zim to help him on his mission. This episode was actually rejected by Nickelodeon for being too similar to an episode that Jimmy Neutron had already done, an episode called When Pants Attack that also featured conscious pants that moved on their own. So even if Invader Zim wasn't cancelled, the show's writers still wouldn't have been able to make this episode. Years later though, in 2016, the script would be later adapted on the 8th issue of Invader Zim comics under the title When Pants Ruled, and it was written by series writer Eric Trueheart. So it's nice that they still found a way to adapt the idea after so many years. Season 2 was also allegedly meant to have a two-parter as its season finale, but there hasn't been any concrete details on what it might have been about. And despite its untimely cancellation, the show managed to stay relevant in the years since by becoming a cult classic among animation fans. The show's creator, Jonan Vasquez, continued working on different projects, drawing and writing different comics. He even drew a story about MODOK for Marvel's Strange Tales, and he later did a comic about Wolverine. Vasquez also worked with Disney XD for a bit, doing the character designs for the show Randy Cunningham, 9th Grade Ninja. In 2013, Comics Alliance published an article reporting that Vasquez had announced that he was making an animated short adaptation of Squee, and was looking into adapting Johnny the Homicidal Maniac into animation as well, collaborating with animation studio Titmouse, but no further news were revealed after this. He later pitched to Disney XD an idea for an animated series titled Very Important House, following a 12-year-old girl named Frawley who had recently moved into the very important house with her cat Grandpa, and she actually became the caretaker of the universe, having to deal with bizarre situations that are very important. He produced a pilot, and there have only been some clips of it shared online, but the pitch was ultimately rejected.
I'm feeling real sick, but this thing's so good, I have to finish it.
Vasquez later oversaw the creation of an Invader Zim comic book revival in 2015, published by Oni Press, with writer Eric Trueheart and artist Aaron Alexovich. both of whom had previously worked on the original show, also coming back to work on its comic book revival. This continued fan interest in the show, despite him being dead for years, made Nickelodeon consider the possibility of reviving it in some manner, and Jonan Vasquez considered making a 6-episode miniseries, but in the end, he chose to create a movie instead, which is how we eventually saw the Enter the Florpus animated movie released on Netflix in 2019. This movie follows Zim as he realizes that the Almighty Tallest and the Urkin Empire's quest for conquest never really intended to actually invade Earth, since Earth isn't even on the path that they're traveling throughout space. After realizing this, Zim actually managed to conquer Earth and transport it right in the middle of the Urkin Empire's path. That way, the Almighty Tallest and the Urkin could no longer ignore him and his accomplishments. This was a really good movie in my opinion. I liked it a lot. It maintained the bizarre, fast-paced comedy from the show, while also playing into some of its horror undertones. The animation was also very fluid, and the best part by far is that Dr. Membrane actually did a Kamehameha.
I never hired any of you!
In the end, while Invader Zim was undeniably mishandled by the network when it originally released, it's still commendable how the show made such an impact with the kids that grew up watching it that we never forgot about it, even though it only lasted for 2 short seasons. It's a testament to the ingenious imagination of its writers and artists, and how the risks they took in creating such a subversive cartoon ultimately paid off, even though it wasn't immediately appreciated when it first aired. And hopefully, if we continue showing our appreciation for it, we might even get to see yet another Invader Zim revival in the future. And as long as they're able to get back Jonan Vasquez and the same creative team behind the original series, I will always love to see more stories set in this world. But now please, tell me, what do you think of Invader Zim? What rejected episode or idea that we went over did you like the most? I personally would have loved to see the trial get adapted. It sounded like a really interesting episode, and would you like to see it get a new revival of some kind? Like, imagine if we got to see a more adult-oriented Invader Zim show, kinda like what we could have got to see had the show been moved to MTV. Please, share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, thank you so much for watching.